The people who are arguing that there's 215 children buried in the Kamloops apple orchard don't have any case. There's no case.
What about like civil rights and human rights to be in a area without hate speech directed at them?
There's been no finding that I engaged in hate speech.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. We are going to start the proceedings. So, folks in the back, you are welcome to come down to the front. I promise you, none of us smell too badly. So,
I can't promise anything.
There's no room.
I can't promise anything.
No space.
but thank you for coming. So this would be the first annual Tomas Hudlicky Memorial Lecture for Academic Freedom, featuring former Mount Royal University professor Dr. Francis Widdowson. So Dr. Widdowson will be speaking on the fairly recent controversy surrounding the Kamloops residential school, a topic of much debate and contention, to put it mildly. So I'll leave it to Dr. Widdowson to elucidate that in her talk. But Bridge Over Troubled Water, the title of Simon Garfunkel's classic ballad, could well double as a description of what sorely needed today's culture war plagued academy. I was always partial to Elvis's cover, but that's just me. In recent years, it seems that protests, air horns, trigger warnings, and puppy rooms are all almost as endemic to university culture as exams, student accommodation requests, tedious grading, haggling with REB officials, and deflating feedback from journal reviewers. In the US as well as Canada, universities have come under intense scrutiny for perceived censorship, escalating political correctness, and relatedly a supposed and growing intolerance of intellectual pluralism. In ongoing efforts to counter historical and ongoing patterns of exclusion, progressive faculty, activists, and administrators continually strive to create equitable and inclusive academic environments. However, critics argue that this egalitarian vision, however noble, has promoted a culture of safeties, to borrow a term from Gregory Piana and Jonathan, and result in censorship that many see as inimical to the truth-seeking mission of the university. This situation has been deemed so dire by a sufficiently large contingent that in 2018, the provincial government of Ontario enacted a mandate that required, quoting from a policy statement issued by the Premier's office, quote, every publicly assisted college and university must develop and publicly post its own free speech policy that meets a minimum standard specified by the government. Concerned faculty of various Canadian universities have formed organizations such as the Heterodox Academy and the Society for Academic Freedom, or SAFs, that aim to promote and protect open inquiry and viewpoint diversity on post-secondary campuses. Writing for SAFs, Christina Behume lists periodical headlines that, to her, capture the prevailing state of academia. Quote, hardly a week passes without some new publication on the topic. Often, though not always, these publications are prompted by the shouting down of usually, though not always, a conservative speaker on a university campus, and have catchy headlines like "Progressives Shut Down Christina Hoff Sommers at Portland Law School," or "Jordan Peterson versus the New Freedom Fighters at Queen's University," end quote. In a 2017 New York Times op-ed entitled "The Dying Art of Disagreement," journalist Brett Stevens invites attention to parallel concerns in the U.S. when he presents a sample list of political and cultural luminaries who have had speaking engagements on American campuses and universities rescinded amid controversy. The roster of disinvited, quote, the roster of disinvited speakers and forced cancellations include Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and Condoleezza Rice, former Harvard University President Larry Summers, actor Alec Baldwin, DNA co-discoverer James Watson, filmmaker Michael Moore, conservative Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist George Well, liberal Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Anna Quinn, to name just a few, end quote. This has to strike anyone who cares about the Academy as a sad state of affairs. Given the historical role of higher education as a truth-seeking entity, there are perhaps no two concepts of greater centrality to the professional environment of academia and the vocation of university professor than free speech and academic freedom. Faculty and grad students rely on these principles when performing their professional and scholarly roles as knowledge producers and disseminators. Dr. Widdowson is one of the people who stands up for these principles. Whatever you might think of her perspective and scholarship, and I realize there are many critics, we think it's important to hear her out. If you feel you hold a perspective that's more valid, feel free to share that perspective in the Q&A at the end of her talk. It's only through rational and civil dialogue that any semblance of truth can be ciphered. So in that vein, we ask people to remain respectful and civil throughout the presentation. We thank Dr. Widdowson for coming to Brock, and I'll now give the floor to Dr. Ron Thomson, who will share a few words about the namesake of this event, Dr. Hudlicky.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everybody. Echo Kevin's welcome. Thank you for coming. I just want to say a little bit, in case some people here aren't aware of the story of Tomas Hudlicky, and that is that he was recruited by Brock as Brock's #1 scientist. He had patents on cancer drugs. He was an organic chemist of international renown. And in June of 2020, he said something that the, I guess, Twitter mob didn't agree with, which is that he wrote an article that was peer-reviewed and published in a major organic chemistry journal, in which he talked about threats to the field of organic chemistry, and he had the opinion, which it was irrelevant to me at the time who did or didn't agree with it, but he had the opinion that one of those threats was what's known as EDI. And so he had that opinion, he was mobbed on Twitter, and Brock, instead of defending his right to academic freedom, they put out two public statements against him. And when I spoke to the St. Catharines Standard about him and defended his right to academic freedom, I had never met Tomas, but he contacted me because of that connection. He said that I was one of very few people on campus who had defended his right to academic freedom. His own colleagues had kind of ignored the situation. And so during COVID, this was June of 2020, I had several meetings over drinks with Tomas on his back deck and commiserated with him about what was going on and the way that the institution was treating him. Again, not taking a particular position on the matter. I don't need to say what my position is on that. There were things that I didn't agree with Tomas. But I also saw the effect that this was having on Tomas. And so eventually, Tomas died a tragic, sudden death, and of a heart attack, I understand. And at his celebration of life, which was well attended by many people at Brock, many colleagues who had not supported him during his life, 3 people talked, and they spoke about him who were close to him, in addition to his life partner who was there but didn't share the way these other 3 did. And the thing that was common that struck me about those 3 was that all 3 of them attributed Tomas's death to the stress that Brock University put him under. So I think that that is why I've kind of got on this issue and started supporting academic freedom more openly. And I say that because I want to draw attention to the fact that university professors have tenure. I don't know if everybody in here understands what that means, but I've always had the position that tenure isn't a right, it's an obligation. And that if we don't use our tenure, which means that we're protected as academics, we get paid a huge amount of money to try and challenge the status quo, but if we don't use our tenure, that we will lose it. And so the fact that most professors at Brock are not here tonight suggests that they're not using their tenure. And I think that that's a bad thing, because when people do use their tenure, as Dr. Widdowson did, they pay a heavy price, as Tomas Hudlicky did. And so Dr. Widdowson has paid a heavy price for speaking openly. It doesn't matter to me whether I agree or disagree with someone like Professor Widdowson. The fact is that I somehow understand what's at stake here, and I think more people need to be as courageous as she is in challenging the status quo. The last thing that I want to say about her is that many people that I've heard critiquing her, and messages and things on social media, if you were to ask those people, have you ever actually heard her speak or read anything that she's written? The answer will almost unanimously be no. And I think that's also a very precarious position for the Academy to be in. One person commented, well, it's true that people have a right to free speech. They do not have a right to be listened to. On its face, that is a ridiculous statement, because if people don't listen to our ideas, then what's the point of speaking? And so I think that Dr. Widdowson does have a right to be listened to. It doesn't matter whether you agree with her, but people here also have a right to not listen to her. And if you choose not to listen to her, you can leave the room. But if you're here, you're choosing to listen to her. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Widdowson. Again, thank you for your courage.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Francis Widdowson. I was a professor at Mount Royal University until I was fired in 2021. And I am still fighting that fight. I won my case. People tell me there's some serious problems that I have with the decision that was reached regarding my conduct at Mount Royal University. That is not being appealed, or there is a sliver that is being appealed. But the main thing that's being appealed is the lack of reinstatement, because I should be reinstated at Mount Royal University. I will fight to the end of my days to be reinstated at Mount Royal University, because the fact that I am not there shows that Mount Royal University is not an academic institution. It is an institution that is ruled by activism. And if we are going to restore that institution, which was a wonderful institution in 2008, with administrators such as Robin Fisher as the provost and Manuel Merton as the dean of arts, who protected academic freedom and understood what an academic institution was all about, we can restore that institution. And the battle is not over yet. I will not be bought off by the various processes that are going on. I am sounding the alarm loud and clear right now, and this is what I would like to speak about today with respect to one of the fundamental issues that is connected to me being terminated from Mount Royal University. Before I do that, however, I wanted to mention Tomas Hudlicky, who I had the honor of interacting with before his death. Thomas was defended by the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which everyone can become a member, and if you are concerned about academic freedom in universities, you should become a member. It is very, very expensive. It is $25 a year. It is just a serious hit to your financial situation to become a member, and you can support incredible colleagues who are working to make universities what they should be in the university. Anyway, I talked to Tomas, and I was very, very disturbed because Tomas was a superstar. He was recruited and came to Brock as someone who was appreciated for his incredible work that he was doing in organic chemistry. And when he was betrayed by his institution, it hit him very, very hard. And I interacted with him, and I tried to encourage him as much as I could, but the damage was done to him. And unfortunately, you know, it takes a toll. It really does take a toll, especially if you're not expecting that kind of treatment. So I really wanted to say I appreciate everything that Tomas did for universities and for the discipline of chemistry, and his name should not be forgotten. And what Brock University did to Tomas Hudlicky, which I do not think they've ever declared a formal apology to what they did, they should hang their heads in shame. Everyone who did what they did to Tomas Hudlicky, and until he receives a formal apology, justice has not been done for him, and we are waiting. We are waiting for that apology to come, but I guess we should not hold our breath, because the way universities are going, one should not expect principled treatment with respect to the administration. Anyway, I've put my own picture there with Tomas. I don't see myself as being at the same level as him, but I think our battles are touching upon particular themes. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was my own circumstances in terms of the research that I have done with respect to this book, which is called Grave Error, which is edited by Chris Champion and Tom Flanagan, which tells a number of very important truths about what is happening with respect to the discussions of Indigenous residential schools, specifically with respect to the Kamloops case. And my research in particular over the last 3.5 years has been done with respect to the Kamloops case. And I wanted to talk to you about that in connection to academic freedom, which both Kevin and Ron talked about. Academic freedom, what that means, and then how does that apply to the Kamloops case. So, in terms of the lecture slides, I just wanted, sorry, I got two computers going in here, so I don't want to be confused about this. I wanted to touch upon, first of all, what academic freedom is, and I know there's a number of people who were at the class today of Tamari Kitossa, and that was a wonderful class that we had. So this is going to be a bit of a repetition, but still it'll bring about some themes that we discussed earlier on. And then I'm going to talk about the specific Kamloops case in terms of what was the grave error that happened with respect to that case. And I have many discussions with people across the country about this, and this error is still been absorbed by people, and they don't understand that erroneous information was provided in May 2021. So we want to state what that is and what the background was about that, and then how it is not a probable hypothesis as to whether or not the claim is true with respect to that case, and then finally ending up on this question of the hoax. And that is a question which has been raised by numerous people across the country. That error that was made in May 2021, can we describe it that way? And there's academics who argue that we shouldn't describe it that way. There's academics who argue that we should. And then there's my own position, which is I'm in the spectrum street epistemology type of spectrum. You know, I'm in the middle with respect to this. I have a slight tendency towards one direction, but if you provide me with evidence in opposition to my view, I can change my mind. And I should mention as well that tomorrow in the afternoon, probably around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at a location that's going to be disclosed tomorrow. We're still working on this. We're going to do some spectrum street epistemology on a related question, which is what has been called residential school denialism. That's something that has been put forward as a descriptor. We want to investigate the claim residential school denialism should be made illegal. And there are talks that are being put forward today and tomorrow in Gatineau, Quebec, that are making that argument. Some people claim that this should occur, other people are disagreeing with it. And if you are on one position or another with respect to that question, what evidence would you require to move towards the claim that residential school denialism should be illegal or that it should not be illegal? That's something that we're going to be exploring tomorrow at Brock University. Okay, so I'll give a lecture, and then after the lecture is done, we can have a question and answer period about some of the things that I've said. So, for people who were at Dr. Kitossa's lecture this morning or this afternoon, this will be a bit of a repetition, but in terms of academic freedom, UNESCO put forward a definition in 1997, and as professors we have a specific calling, which is we are investigating ideas. And so we want to figure out what is true, and we should be able to do that freely without having a prescribed doctrine, which is a predetermined conclusion that is imposed upon us. So, for example, the predetermined conclusion that the residential schools were genocidal. That's a view that some people hold, some people contest. That should not be declared to be a position of a university. And at Mount Royal University in the year 2020, there was a motion that was passed at General Faculty's Council which declared that the residential schools were genocidal. That should never happen at an institution because it gives a university, because it gives a signal to the people who are working at that institution and the students that are attending there, that that is the declared position. And if you oppose that, you will feel somewhat reluctant to express your opinion. And universities should not have these positions. They should encourage everyone to come together to be able to discuss the evidence and arguments that are put forward to support one position or another with respect to this. And if you do have a prescribed doctrine at an institution, the result will be institutional censorship, which can be that you are deprived of various resources, you don't get promotions and so on. But the worst institutional censorship that you can receive is to be terminated from your position at a university. And that is what Mount Royal University did, is that because of their prescribed doctrine on various aspects of indigenization, people who took issue with that had an environment created that was poisonous and made it impossible for them to ask questions about what was being done with respect to indigenization. And one aspect about that was the discussions about the residential schools. As well, in universities, academic decisions should be made by academics. The intellectuals who have backgrounds in these areas, you shouldn't have outside intervention in determining how the curriculum or various discussions should occur. This includes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Universities should not have stated that they were going to just incorporate those. We could have had discussions about them on which ones were valid and which ones were invalid, but by saying we were going to incorporate those whole scale without discussion was a violation of that principle of academic freedom. Okay, so that's giving you a background on academic freedom. What we want to talk about now is this particular issue. Grave error regarding the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and how does that relate to academic freedom? So the first thing is, what was the grave error? And I know this is difficult to read, but I just wanted you to have the whole situation provided to you. This presentation has been provided on a website, www.wokeacademy.info, which you can just look at the specific details. But just to give you a few highlights of this situation, it starts off on May 21st, when the GPR work was done at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So what happened is Dr. Sarah Bollier, who was the GPR expert, she did her work then. And as a result of her GPR findings, she made some kind of reported verbally to the Kamloops band about 215 anomalies being found on the GPR. We don't have a written report. We have not seen a written report, which was done by Dr. Sarah Bollier, but there was a press release that was embargoed by the Kamloops band on May 25th, 2021. This was provided to a number of journalists. One of the journalists who got this press release was Tanya Talaga from the Globe and Mail. This was in her book, The Knowing. She let that be she declared this in her book. And then on May 27th, that's when the world learned that what they said in the press release was that the remains of 215 children had been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, in the apple orchard, in what was the apple orchard there. We don't know whether that was something that Sarah Bollier told the Kamloops band or whether that was an interpretation of the Kamloops band. As a result of that announcement, all sorts of newspaper columns were written, articles were written. The New York Times, for example, said that a mass grave had been found with the remains of 215 children in that. A number of other things happened. One of the most significant was on June 3rd, Murray Sinclair made a presentation to a parliamentary committee saying that Bollier, the GPR expert, was being pressured by the RCMP, and as a result of his statement that he made in this parliamentary committee, the RCMP abandoned the investigation that they were undertaking about the Kamloops case. As well, on June 3rd, 17 lawyers put forth a complaint to the International Criminal Court, declaring that crimes against humanity had been committed because of the 215, what was the statement that they made? The recent discovery of a mass unmarked grave of 215 Indigenous children. So these things all happened in May and June of 2021. And then on June 15th, 2021, there was a presentation given by the GPR expert, Sarah Bollier, who stated that it was not the remains of 215 children, it was in fact 200 anomalies or targets of interest, which had been found. And you might be wondering why the 215 changed to 200. It was because Sarah Bollier discovered that 15 of those anomalies that she had discovered had occurred where excavations had previously been undertaken by the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department. So she thought that those 15 anomalies were the remains of children, or maybe not. The band thought that. They were just due to soil disturbances from excavations. This raises the question, if she made the mistake with respect to those 15, what about the other 200? Could those have also been due to the excavations that have been taking place on the Kamloops site for 100 years, the most significant being the laying of septic tiles, which took up configurations very similar to what was found on the GPR. So that was made, that admittance was made on July 15th, 2021. All the band members were there. It was known that was the case. Why then did we have later on in that year, in October, that a petition was made to Prime Minister Trudeau talking about the 215 children that were discovered at Kamloops, made by members of the Kamloops band. So those are all considerations to keep in mind with respect to this issue. And then finally, on May 18th, the Kamloops band made the announcement. So this was in 2024, 3 years later. They changed the remains to the 215 anomalies being detected. So it took 3 years for that to happen. The question is, how are we to interpret this sequence of events? And this is a matter for academic debate within various disciplines in the university. And that's something that we need to think about as to why those events unfolded the way that they did. So, first of all is, it was maintained that the remains of 215 children exist in the old apple orchard. That's a hypothesis. There could be the remains of 215 children in the old Kamloops apple orchard. This seems to be a very improbable hypothesis that this is the case. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons why it's improbable is that it's not 215 at all, according to Sarah Bollier. It can't, according to her, it's not 215 we're talking about. It's 200 because of the 15 mistaken kind of hits due to the archaeology department's findings. She mentioned initially one of the reasons why we thought that there were remains of children is because it was claimed that there was a tooth, a juvenile tooth, and a human rib bone. The tooth turned out not to be human, and no one knows where the rib bone is. Now that seems very odd. If you have a human remains, sort of evidence of human remains, you don't just have that disappear. That's a matter to be investigated by criminal investigations. If you find a rib bone, a human rib bone somewhere, you don't just turn it over to anybody. You go to the police and you have them investigate what happened there. Who is this person to whom this rib bone belongs? So that is another odd situation. In terms of missing children from Kamloops, not one parent has said that their child went missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. If this is the case, who are the 215 bodies in the Kamloops apple orchard? That is a huge number of human remains that would exist there, that would have been buried clandestinely. That seems to be a very improbable situation. And finally, we only have 2 eyewitness accounts about burials at Kamloops. Both of these are connected to Kevin Annett, who was a defrocked United Church minister who has made all sorts of claims about torture chambers and so on at residential schools. And the eyewitnesses are Jesse Jules and Billy Coombs. Jesse Jules, we have never been able to contact about this. Billy Coombs died, and Billy Coombs put forward other implausible stories, one of the most famous being that Queen Elizabeth II abducted 10 children from the Kamloops Indian Residential School in 1964. Queen Elizabeth II was not in Kamloops in 1964, and even if she were in Kamloops, the Queen's visits are heavily monitored by the press. How would it be possible for the Queen on an official visit to abduct 10 children? That's a very implausible hypothesis. So all of these circumstances make one somewhat skeptical of the claim that the remains of 215 children are buried in the Kamloops apple orchard. So that seems to me to be the grave error, that we have been expected to believe something which is highly implausible. So that is the situation with respect to the grave error. The academic question, or one of the academic questions, is that scenario that I just explained and all those different things which happened between May 27, 2021 until the declaration of the anomalies in May 2024. Should that be described as a hoax? And first of all, that requires a definition of what a hoax is. And so a hoax, first of all, has to be intentional. It can't be a mistake, okay? And fraud, fabrication, these sorts of things, this is what we're dealing with here. And often it has a slightly, sort of a trick. So it's like, playing a joke on someone. That's kind of the connotation that often comes about with a hoax. And there's a number of different views on this amongst academics as to whether it's a hoax or not. So Reed Gerbrandt and Sean Carlton and Negan Sinclair. Sean Carlton and Negan Sinclair are from the University of Manitoba. And Tamari, today, I was very impressed this afternoon in Tamari's class. Tamari is a very measured academic who never, casts aspersions on his colleagues. And I've got to admit, I've cast some aspersions on Sean Carlton, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba, and I've been taken to task for this. I refer to Sean Carlton as an uber clown, a clown of all clowns. And perhaps that is not an appropriate way for me to refer to him. I'm still open to this. I'm on a neutral. I'll put myself on the neutral mat in street epistemology. And the reason why I refer to him this way is because he is an unbelievable bad actor. He does things which show that he has no interest whatsoever in the academic character of these discussions. And this is why I have gone after him in the way that I have, and I have a post on his uber clownery that I have put on the wokeacademy.info site. And perhaps that was a mistake on my part, and I should maybe change my mind about that, but I'll just put myself on the neutral position with respect to this. Anyway, he and a grad student, Reed Gerbrandt, wrote a piece on this matter, and he is arguing that, first of all, the Kamloops case should not be referred to as a hoax, and it is, in fact, this is a serious kind of error on the fact of people making this claim. But there's a few things about the way he characterizes this which I think are not valid. First of all, he says, he refers to it as a mass grave hoax. So people are making claims about a mass grave. And that would not be the nature of the hoax necessarily. It's not referring to a mass grave. What's being referred to is, what's being implied is that there are a number of clandestine burials that exist at Kamloops. So it doesn't need to be a mass grave for it to be a hoax. And I'm not saying it is a hoax. I'm just saying you could claim it's a hoax without saying there's a mass grave there. The hoax is saying that there's clandestine burials there. And Gerbrandt and Carleton are claiming that this aspersions about the hoax it's a far right. It's coming from the far right, and it's an expression of residential school denialism. So anyone who claims it's a hoax are far right. They're a far right element, and they're engaging in residential school denialism. And that's not really dealing with the issue, which is concerning the definition of a hoax, which is, first of all, intentional to deceive, and a trick, an attempt to dupe people. That's what's got to be looked at, not whether you have these things called residential school denialism and whether people are from the far right and so on, these kinds of considerations. And then Negan Sinclair is talking about the language that he uses in 2024 when he's talking about this is he's saying that it was revealed in 2021 that ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies potentially representing the remains of 215 children. And Gerbrandt and Carleton say that there was a 2021 announcement about the location of 215 potential unmarked graves. Let's be honest here. In 2021, the Kamloops ban did not say potential unmarked graves or potentially representing the remains of 215 children. They said, I quote, the remains of 215 children had been found. That's what they stated. So we have to be accurate about what happened in May of 2021, and that's not being made clear by Gerbrandt, Carleton, and Sinclair. They are rewriting history to suit their own particular view of this situation, which I think is not being honest about this situation. So it seems to me that their discussion about whether it was a hoax or not is distorting a whole bunch of information to prevent us from accurately assessing that situation. Academics Jaime Rubenstein and Tom Flanagan argue that it was a hoax. That's their position. And I'm not saying that they're correct in describing it this way. In fact, I slightly disagree with their position, but this is the reasons which they give as to why they argue that it's a hoax. First of all, there was a repetition of known falsehoods. And the biggest evidence for that was Sarah Bollier gave her presentation in July 2021, saying that there were 200 anomalies or targets of interest. In October 2021, so that was a number of months after that, we had a petition from several family heads of the Kamloops band, which were talking about the remains of 215 children. So they knew at that point that there were not remains of 215 children that had been found, but they continued to state those falsehoods. Now, whether they intentionally did that or not is a big issue, which I'll talk about shortly, but that's what happened. Now, maybe for Flanagan and Rubenstein, that's an indication of a hoax. The control over the messaging. Racel Cooey, who was the public relations person who was controlling all the messaging, preventing various media outlets from coming to Kamloops, controlling the live streaming, preventing that from happening, controlling the questioning. There was an attempt to clamp down on any skeptical kinds of positions that were being put forward in various press conferences. Potentially that is evidence of what Rubenstein and Flanagan call a hoax. There was collusion amongst a number of bodies, journalists, the band, the RCMP, other bands in British Columbia. So if they're interacting with respect to this messaging, is that indications of a hoax? And finally, there's $330 million that were allocated by the federal government with respect to following the Kamloops case to look for these missing children and unmarked graves. The Kamloops band received $8 million with respect to its claim that the remains of 215 children have been found. According to Rubenstein and Flanagan, financial incentives can be part of the development of a hoax that's perpetrated. The deception could be financially motivated, is one possible explanation. So that's the reasons that have been given for why the grave error at Kamloops could be described as a hoax. I do not think it should be described as a hoax. I slightly disagree. I can be moved. As I mentioned, I do not think this is a helpful way to describe this. There might have been some deception that's involved, but I think a much larger issue is a number of factors that are known in psychology to exist in all contexts, and it's not just about the residential schools issue. Anytime someone has a memory of anything, it's highly likely that that memory is not accurate, not completely accurate. And the longer that memory, the length of time that memory is held for, the more likely that memory is not going to be accurate. And it's a phenomenon known as misremembering. And the more you recall that memory in highly emotional contexts, the more that memory is going to be distorted according to what you're hearing at the time that that memory is recalled. And that seems to be a major type of influence in what's happening with respect to the grave error at Kamloops. You have people recounting things in the presence of others who are also recounting other memories. Kevin Annett made a film in 2007 called Unrepentant. All sorts of testimonies were made, and so a number of people would have viewed that film. Billy Coombs' testimony appears on that film, Unrepentant. The whole Truth and Reconciliation testimonies that were given during that commission. This is highly emotional circumstances, which you would have memories being influenced by other memories. So, and I think that's a big part of the story. That's not a hoax. That's just people being mistaken. And I think that we need to be charitable in this situation. Second is what's called confirmation bias. People remember or go forward in terms of ideas which are consistent with their preconceived ideas, and they're reluctant to accept views that contradict their deeply held beliefs. This definitely is something that probably would apply with respect to the Kamloops case. And finally, and this is something that Ronald Thomson put forward in his book, Truth and Indignation, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, is he said that there is, in many Indigenous communities, or many Indigenous people don't have the same conception of truth as is existent in what would be considered to be an Enlightenment position in universities, where truth is a universal. So there's a truth that we're all trying to move towards. That's the Enlightenment position. In many Indigenous communities, there's the idea of what's called relative truths, and Jonathan Thomson talks about this. So that is that it's true if you believe it to be true. And so this is what's happening a lot with the kind of the pressure to accept the testimonies of survivors, what's called survivors of Indigenous residential schools. It's what they believe to be true. And if you are a compassionate person, you will accept as true what they believe to be true. And this is not the idea of truth which exists within universities which are built upon the principles of the Enlightenment. And I think that idea of relative truth, what people believe to be true, is coloring the discussions of the Kamloops case. And we have the authoritative source of George Costanza. And there's a very funny episode, and I believe Will has made this, referred to George Costanza, the authoritative source of George Costanza. There's a point where he tells Jerry Seinfeld, remember, Jerry, it's not a lie if you believe it. And that's the same with the idea of a hoax, is that if people really believe that there's the remains of 215 children buried in Kamloops, that's not a hoax, because they truly believe that is the case. And so we should be talking about the problems of memory and how people can be mistaken without accusing people of engaging in deliberate deception. So my own view is that there perhaps are some people who are involved in deliberate deceptions, but that's not the major issue. The major issue is misremembering and confirmation bias, and really not having a kind of this idea of truth that we accept in universities which are founded on Enlightenment principles. So, the grave area of Kamloops, just getting back to the academic freedom issue, I think that the grave area, the book Grave Area, and the kinds of discussions that are going on with respect to that book, that has major implications for universities and discussions about the Kamloops case. Because I think, and this happened in May 2021, at my own university, and I saw this at other universities, where presidents of universities came out and made a declaration about the bodies of 215 children being found. As far as I know, none of those presidents and none of those universities have provided a retraction to what they stated there, because that was false. And at my own university, Mount Royal University, that announcement by the president about the remains of 215 children being found, that remains on the website of Mount Royal University. So this created, these presidents doing this, created what we call a prescribed doctrine, that this is the official position of the university, and if you oppose that and if you question that, you're going to be at a disadvantage within that university, and you're going to have, in my case, a poisonous work environment created by people sort of saying that I was not abiding by the official position of the university. And what's happening is that you are expected to affirm what's called the genocide survivor identity, which is deeply connected to the claim that the remains of 215 children were found, because that was one of the pieces of evidence that was given by the 17 lawyers who put forward that claim to the International Criminal Court, that a crime against humanity had been committed, which was that there are 215 bodies that are there in Kamloops. So you're expected to affirm this genocide survivor identity, and if you question whether genocide actually occurred with respect to the residential schools, you're going to have trouble at universities. Secondly, we have these accusations, which we're going to be talking about tomorrow in the Spectrum Street epistemology session, about what's called residential school denialism. That accusation is drawing a parallel with Holocaust denial, right? So the Holocaust, which is a well-documented situation that happened in the 1940s in Germany, if you deny that genocide happened with respect to the residential schools, you're sort of equated to being someone who's denying that millions of people were exterminated in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. And that's something that is a very, very stigmatizing thing to be putting on the heads of academics who are trying to, critically analyze this claim. And people like, Sean Carlton and Negon Sinclair, Keisha Supernant, who are the three people who are really, sort of putting forward the view about clandestine burials, they will not engage at all with people who are critical of their viewpoints, because they say they don't want to give legitimacy to residential school denialists. That is a serious blow to the academic process. And what we have is really highly improbable claims that are being made now about various cases like Kamloops and other residential schools across the country. So what we need to do is we need to have open and honest discussion about these matters, not having all this grandstanding that's occurring about, oh, I don't want to be associated with so-and-so because they're a residential school denialist, which doesn't make any sense, that claim anyway. And so as a result of all this prescribed doctrine, what we have is a whole bunch of forms of institutional censorship that are going on. Brock University and Wilfrid Laurier, over the last 2 days, we have dealt a serious blow to this institutional censorship, which is going on at universities. I was canceled at the University of Regina. I was going to give a talk there, the same talk there as I'm giving here. I produced a documentary with Daniel Page on this called The University of Regina Rumble. And everyone should take a look at that documentary, because that shows what institutional censorship looks like in universities today. But censorship is not the main problem. When people see what happens to people when they get canceled and fired and pushed out of universities for trying to put forward what they think is true, what you see is self-censorship. People afraid to kind of even express a slight disagreement with the existing position. And what we have then is a situation of what Jonathan Roche calls coerced conformity. So people think that everyone's in agreement about a particular subject, a particular claim, when in fact many people are not convinced, but everyone thinks that they are, because everyone is afraid to state what they think is true or even express any kinds of reservations. And that is the death knell for academic institutions in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Widdowson. So we are now in the Q&A portion of the talk. So for this portion of the talk, I am going to steal a gimmick from Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, when they stage talk at the university campuses. Is there anyone who disagrees with any part of what Dr. Widdowson had to say, or her overall thesis? Anyone who vehemently disagrees, or disagrees at all? Okay. I'm going to have people who disagree ask questions first. So, lady in the blue.
Can I get you on the microphone too?
Do you mind if I rub?
I can speak loudly, that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So I understand that you're arguing that academic freedom is a right for each of us to have, but you observe the right that universities to have for sheltering hate speech and those that target disenfranchised and vulnerable populations.
Whether
Whether you accept that universities do hold the power to not have hate speech and the attacking of vulnerable populations in their university, because your argument, one of them, is that you were fired because, but it was against your rights. But what about like civil rights and human rights to be in a area without hate speech directed at them?
Well, the universities right now must abide by the law. So if anyone puts forward hate speech, a complaint can be made to prevent that individual from speaking. So that's a situation that exists in the law right now.
Yeah. So do you believe that's not what happened in your case? There were no formal complaints made about the speech and topic that you're bringing against Indigenous schools?
So there's been no finding that I engaged in hate speech.
Okay.
And so hate speech, just so people know what so first of all, I don't think hate speech should be in legislation. I'm opposed to that because I think we should follow the American model, which is incitement, imminent incitement of a criminal act. I think the Americans got that right because the legal definition of hate speech is opening up a protected group to detestation and vilification. So that's the definition of hate speech, and I think that is a very unclear definition. And as I think you might be arguing, you might say, for example, that my presentation here could potentially open up a protected group to detestation and vilification. That could be a claim that was made.
Yes, technically I believe, because and this is my personal
Yes.
belief, is that I know you say you're not a denier, or I don't know if you say you are, you say you're in the middle for a lot of things, of Indigenous residential schools, like the residential school denialism. But do you believe that doesn't hurt and target real-life stories of survivors of Indigenous schools who have testified to the atrocities that they have, and all of the publications that have come out that reinforce the atrocities that happen in residential schools and the deaths? Like some of the earliest being the Bryce report in 1923 that talked about the deaths and the genocide that was happening in these schools.
Well, I don't think, so I'm very aware of Bryce's report. So there's a number of issues there. People dying, children dying from tuberculosis, which was Bryce's main point. No one is denying that children died from tuberculosis in high numbers, and according to Bryce, it was largely due to the ventilation problems in these schools, so that's not being denied. The question is, what is residential school denialism? What does that mean? And that's not very, according to Sean Carlton, the definition of residential school denialism is distorting facts about the residential schools to uphold the system of colonialism. That's his definition. So the question would be, what are the facts that are being distorted in this presentation?
gentleman with the black water bottle.
Well, my first question is just that, so you said that you don't believe it's a hoax, but that you understand why it could maybe be seen as one. So my question to you is that, do you believe that all the supposed misinformation about what happened, do you believe it was intentional or non-intentional? And if you do believe it was intentional, then why do you think that was the case? Like, why would they lie about this? Who benefits from lying about this? Because I think you mentioned this $8 million payout. So were they just lying about it so that they would get this big payout, or what's the reason behind it?
So I think it's a mixed bag. For people who are aware of my work, Albert Howard and I wrote a book called Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, and that is a legally driven initiative. So lawyers, starting in the 1990s, saw that there was money to be made from this issue and actively went into, and this was not Indigenous people, this was non-Indigenous lawyers going into Indigenous communities, convincing Indigenous people to sign up for all these court cases that went on. So I think that the 17 lawyers who were involved in the complaint to the International Criminal Court on June 3rd, 2021, I think I would definitely zero in on them as being serious, fomenters of this situation. I don't think that the people who have the memories were engaged in any kind of hoax. I think that that was what I was talking about, which is the misremembering, the confirmation bias, and the truth, like the idea that if you think that truth is what you believe to be true, then we're going to have a difficult discussion about trying to pursue the truth, because that's not my definition of the truth. And that's not what a number of my colleagues who come out of the Enlightenment tradition believe that what the truth is. The truth is a universal. It's got nothing to do with what I personally believe to be true. It's got to do with the evidence that I put forward to support my argument, and whether other people, not me, everyone else in the scholarly community thinks of that evidence, whether it's reliable or not. So I don't think describing it as a hoax is a helpful way to think about this at all, because I don't think that's the major kind of impetus that we're dealing with. There are people, I think, who are intentionally trying to deceive, but I don't think that's the main kind of thing we're dealing with when we're having arguments about what people remember and so on, which is generally what we're talking about when we get into the evidence that's being provided about this situation.
Thanks for the question. Is there anyone else who is critical of Dr. Richard's perspective? I'd like to ask a question.
I just wanted to ask, if you don't believe anyone is trying to deceive anyone else, or at least maybe that's not the main intention, then what exactly is the purpose of, what is the purpose of your book, The Grave Error, in saying all these things and questioning everyone's intentions?
So I have a chapter in Grave Error. It's edited by, I think there's 17 authors of Grave Error. It's edited by Tom Flanagan and Chris Champion. The purpose of Grave Error was to correct the inaccurate information that was being put forward, specifically about the Kamloops case, but there's other essays in there about the residential schools more generally, and also the media, the incredible abdication of responsibility by journalists who should have been asking these skeptical questions about this issue, which they did not do, and they continue not to do. The worst being Tanya Talaga. Tanya Talaga is not a journalist. She is an activist posing as a journalist. And the fact that she's lauded and has a column in the Globe and Mail is a national disgrace.
I just have a question about, has there ever been an actual archaeological dig to actually look for the bodies in the graves?
No, there hasn't.
There hasn't been.
No.
And is it possible, like you're talking about this misremembering, is it possible that these graves, these children could have died in 1890? And that the people, their family members, have been passed on for generations now, that the memories are not within those families anymore because it's happened so long ago. Because there was a lot of indigenous peoples who died from genocide, from colonialism, from residential schools, starting in the 1830s, right up until the early 1910, 1920s.
These things are possible, so it's an open question. In this specific so there's been this GPR work done in this particular location, which has had excavations done for septic tiles, archaeological digs for, not to do with finding remains at all, to do with land use patterns and so on. So the question is, what are those anomalies that were found on the GPR? And the RCMP, because it was alerted to a potential crime scene, and it was stated by Joanne Archibald, who was the head of the Assembly of First Nation at the time, that it was a crime scene, there should be excavations done on that site to see what those anomalies are. That's what should be done. And I know there's suspicion about the RCMP in terms of its objectivity. You just need to get a number of observers to make sure that it's done in an appropriate way and doesn't have any cover-up or anything like that happening. But before that even happened, Sarah Bollier had a report supposedly that she produced on that site. We've been pressing for 3 years to have that report released to the public so that we can evaluate the methodology that was used to undertake this GPR survey. So we need to have an investigation of the Kamloops site, and until that is done, we will not be able to have any closure about what actually happened. And if people are really thinking that there are the remains of children that are there, shouldn't we be trying to find out whether that's the case or not? It is a completely bizarre situation that we're not doing that.
Tamari, co-organizer. Until this very moment, I have been agnostic on this matter. I'm not forming an opinion. I've waited for experts to inform me about what this situation may or may not be. As a sociologist, someone who looks at evidence and the production of evidence and the triangulation of evidence, are you trying to tell me that until this moment, there's been no communal memory conversation about missing children, missing brothers and sisters from 1960 or whenever, and the universities in the area, they're not interested in doing a dig? Those are two questions, but the other one is, where did these numbers come from? Who put these numbers forward and claim that they were bodies? I don't understand how this happens, where no one is triangulating to try to substantiate at a fundamental level, whether people have memories of missing siblings, uncles. I don't understand.
Just to augment my colleague's question, Frank, are there any records of missing children from?
There's no records of missing children. What we have is, I believe it is 50, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has stated that 52 children died at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. There were 15 deaths during that period of students who were students at that school. Nina Green, and I should mention this, I don't think I specifically mentioned Nina Green. So Nina Green is the incredible researcher who got the research groups going in 2021, and she starts at the facts, the ground level of the documents, of the historical documents. So she has, I believe, found 42 of the death certificates of the 52 determined deaths that had happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Because some of the death certificates, you apply for them and you can't get them. It's not like you can get just every single death certificate. So there's, I think, 10 that are still not been found as to what happened. But that's not to say that those children are missing, because there's not a parent who's saying, hey, I had this child who's named who I never saw again. But there's no case of that. But of those 42, there were children who died in hospital of various illnesses. There's children who died of accidents. There's children, I don't know the specifics, but that's the kind of records that we have of that. In terms of the, the digs, like this has been a demand for 3.5 years. Let's get the excavations done of that site. That's the request that should be happening, because that's the only way. And Sarah Bollier stated this on July 15th, 2021. That's the only way you're going to determine if those anomalies are actually remains. That's the only way. You can't do it any other way. So if we are serious about trying to figure this out, that's what's going to have to be done.
What explanation is offered for not digging?
Pardon me?
What explanation is offered for not digging?
Well, first of all, the Kamloops band stated in, it was Manny Jules in the Fifth Estate documentary that came out in, I think it's February 2022. They said that they were going to do it. So that was decided that they were going to do excavations. So it hasn't really, there has been sort of, some people did say on July 15th, 2021, that the children should be left where they were and should not be disturbed. That concern was raised by, I can't remember the person who was giving a presentation, so there have been some, but the family heads did decide, and supposedly according to Manny Jules in February 2022, that they were going to do excavations. But we haven't seen anything happen in 2.5 years.
So these 52 children that died at this school, do you know what years they passed away?
They did. Some of them didn't die at the school. Some died in hospital. Some died in their home community.
Yeah.
The years were over the length of time of the school. So I think it started in 1890 and ended in.
1960.
Yeah, so it ended in the late I think it closed in the late 60s. So Nina Green wrote a piece on this in the Dorchester Review. She's the authority on it. I didn't do any of the research on the death certificates or anything like that. But we don't have any record of a parent saying that their child went missing at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. That's not a record that exists.
The person with the gray now.
Well, you question the legitimacy of the Kamloops graves. What about the other graves at other schools? Do you believe the legitimacy of those?
So there's two things which need to be distinguished in talking about this. One is there are cemeteries that exist in many communities, some of them which are connected to residential schools, where there were markers on those graves which have deteriorated. Cowessus is the best example. So Cowessus, you might have heard about the 751 number. That was a cemetery that was associated with a hospital in that community, which is now a field with no markers. So there are graves in abandoned cemeteries that don't have markers anymore, where the markers have deteriorated. There are many of those all across the country. And there are many cemeteries where there are non-Indigenous people where cemeteries have been abandoned. So that's one issue, and that seems to be the issue with respect to the unmarked burials, is that, for example, Tanya Talaga, she has an aunt, a great aunt, who was buried in a cemetery in some kind of asylum, which I believe is a cemetery next to the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto. She is currently trying to find out where that aunt exactly is buried. So there's no markers there anymore. It's just beside the Gardiner Expressway. So that's one issue. And people, Indigenous people, want to find out where their relatives are buried. That's a report of Scott Hamilton for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was talking about that. The other is the issue of the clandestine burials. So this is something that has not been substantiated. The issue of clandestine burials. What's happened on the basis of people like Keisha Supernant is that she constantly conflates those two issues. Graves that used to be marked in cemeteries that are no longer marked, and clandestine burials, where there's some kind of foul play and people are buried secretly. Those two things have not been separated to have discussions about that. And so far, there has not been one substantiated instance of a clandestine burial. But there could be. But those two things have to be separated.
Well, the first, I was going to make a point and then ask you a question. The point I was going to make is that, like it's already been mentioned, if the school has been open since 1890, because you keep mentioning the fact that no parents have come forward claiming their child is missing, but is it not possible that if the school was open since 1890, that the children were probably from like 1890, 1900, a very long time ago, and maybe they just weren't keeping records back then? And so the reason that nobody has come forth to claim a missing child is because they don't even know that this child is missing in the first place. They've been dead for centuries. But that's besides the point. The question I was going to ask is, you brought up the idea of Holocaust denial, and I think that's actually a very fair comparison, because the strategy that a lot of Holocaust deniers use is the first thing they basically say is, no, I'm not saying that this didn't happen, I'm just saying that it was exaggerated and that we are misremembering it. And they go on about like academic freedom and how it goes against censorship, and if you want true academic freedom, you should allow us to study the Holocaust, which you should of course be able to study, but they always try to use that in a nefarious way to prove that it's a hoax. And you're also saying that, although you said it's not a hoax, you are essentially saying that you think this whole thing was faked so that the lawyers could get their $8 million payout, which is again eerily similar to people who say the Holocaust was faked because of some economic something like that. So.
We have evidence of murder in the Holocaust. Do we have evidence of murder?
Yes.
What is the evidence of murder for the residential schools?
There's lots of evidence of murder in residential.
What is the evidence of murder?
Study the St. Anne's Residential School in Northern Ontario. There's lots of evidence of murder there.
Who were the murdered children?
The students.
No, we need to have the children who were murdered, the arguments about who murdered them. We need all of this information. In Kamloops, there is no evidence of murder. Okay, there might be murder. We're open to that. But you need to have, first of all, children who were murdered. Who are they? And then who were the potential murderers? For example, I'll just give an example. In the Fifth Estate documentary, there's a woman who's giving testimony. She said that she was walking back from lunch, and she turned her head and she saw 4 boys hanging from a barn. So they were hanging. Gillian Finley from the Fifth Estate, who was interviewing her, did not ask her any questions about that. Who were those boys? who were hanging from the barn. She came back from lunch, did no people in the residential school say, where's these 4 boys, or what happened to them? The parents of those 4 boys, did they ask what happened to them? You know, these are basic questions that need to be asked. We need skepticism about this. So that's all I'm saying. If you're going to make accusations of murder, we need to know who was murdered. How do you know it was murder? What is the evidence? That's all I'm saying. I'm entirely open to the possibility children were murdered, but we have no concrete information about that.
Yes. You do acknowledge in this lecture that many of these 52 children or students that went to the school did die partially due to the conditions of the school. Like I think you mentioned the very poor ventilation. Would you not consider that manslaughter?
That's a good question. It's whether it is manslaughter is judged on whether things could be prevented, whether it was an act that would have, to some extent, been reasonably thought to result in a death. So in that time, you're dealing with resources and all sorts of problems. So the question would be, was there, and it could be criminal negligence. There's another one, criminal negligence causing death. So one would be looking at related scenarios and other kinds of institutional context, and certainly a case could be made for that.
Where poor ventilation is concerned, would that not affect staff as well? So there's a question of whether Indigenous kids were specifically targeted.
Yeah, so you had the building standards and so on. Like there were resources that were not devoted, according to Bryce, which I think many of the arguments that he makes are very valid, that, you know, he's raising the alarm, telling the government this ventilation system is terrible in these schools. He presents his report to the government. The government did respond to his report and did make improvements in some of the schools. And I should mention, Bryce is a celebrated person with respect to his sounding the alarm. He wanted to expand the residential school system. So for people who are arguing that, you know, the residential schools were this kind of genocidal system, the celebrated hero, Peter Bryce, wanted to actually expand that system. So he was not opposed to the residential schools. He thought that there was neglect and more resources should be diverted to make the ventilation systems better in those schools. But certainly a case can be made that there was, the alarm was sounded, the government knew about this, the government did not respond in a proactive enough way. Whether that constitutes manslaughter, criminal negligence, and so on, those are open questions, but I don't think those are the kinds of claims that are being made about priests murdering children. And there have been many cases where Nina Green has looked into various claims and found that, you know, there's death certificates of a child who was supposedly murdered by a priest. This is Sphenia Jones' case in Edmonton, where there's a death certificate of that same child dying of meningitis in a hospital. So it's like every case has to be looked at in terms of the records.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So in regards to the misremembering, would there not have been a chance of misdocumentation or suppression of Indigenous voices during this time that would have either neglected the claims that students were missing or the documents of children being there, which could cause the students being buried without documentation of them being at the school?
Certainly. But the thing is that people are making the claim. The onus is on the people that are making the claim. So we have the claim that 215 children, the remains of 215 children, are buried in the Kamloops apple orchard. That seems to have been done because there was 215 hits on the GPR, and that was then used to make the claim that those 215 hits were remains. When we know that GPR does not find remains, there are other explanations for those hits. And if people are so concerned that these could be the remains of children, why are we not excavating that site as a crime scene? That is just an inexplicable situation that exists, and it's on the RCMP. The RCMP does not just walk away from a crime scene and say, oh well, I guess we've got 215 murders, but we're just not going to look into it. That doesn't happen.
Yes. Wait, going back to the points about murders and students' names and stuff, there's not necessarily Kamloops in general, but the graves and stuff, there's a lot, and it says the names and the date that they died. And the Pope has apologized for the action that the Catholic Church has taken in these residential schools and stuff. And with that said, with the names and stuff, you still don't believe that these kids were killed by the hands of these residential schools?
The names are people who died.
Yes.
The question is not whether people died. The question is whether people were murdered. Murdered has to be established, and I'm not saying that there were no people murdered. I'm saying in every case, there has to be evidence for murder. And I'm just using the case of Sphenia Jones in Edmonton. There's a lawsuit going on now. A woman is claiming that it's against a Polish priest who was saying it was lies in Kamloops. That was what he was saying. Anyway, there's this case going forward. She has claimed that one of her friends was killed by I believe it was a nun, hit over the head. And there's a death certificate saying that child, and it's a named child, that's how we were able to investigate it, that child died of meningitis in the hospital. Now you could say, well, that's because the authorities wanted to cover it up and they manufactured this death certificate and so on. Well, that's possible too, but we'd have to look at that and what the possibilities. It's also possible that Sphenia Jones misremembered that situation. So there's a balancing that goes on. But with respect to the Kamloops case, people are bringing up other instances which I don't have knowledge of, so I feel somewhat uncomfortable in getting into it. All I'm saying is if there are deaths and it's claimed that they're murdered, then you need to get you need to start from the ground up in terms of the evidence about those situations. And with respect to Kamloops, I'm talking about the Kamloops case here, there is no evidence of murder. No evidence. So why are we assuming that that happened? There's two eyewitnesses, Billy Coombs and Jesse Jules. They are unreliable witnesses. And also, Jesse Jules went through the lens of Kevin Annett, who has made all sorts of implausible claims. So he's not a reliable source, and we just have to consider that.
What's considered murder is, again, like the constant abuse and neglect these children face in these schools is that arguably led to their deaths. Is that not considered?
Well, as was just mentioned, you have manslaughter, you have criminal negligence causing death, you have a bunch of different categories, and every single case that you look at, you need to you start from the bottom up. So you have, in the case of Kamloops, 52 deaths that have been documented. As was mentioned, maybe that's not an accurate number. maybe there was a cover-up, maybe all these other things, but that's just speculation. You start with the documents, the hard evidence that you have. Testimonies from people are a piece of evidence, but you've got to consider misremembering, confirmation bias, ideas that a belief is true when, you know, just because you believe it's true, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the case. Various incentives to believe the things that people do. These kinds of questions have to be considered. That's all I'm saying. And people are not being skeptical about this. And with what's happened, although I won't call it a hoax, a lot of skepticism now is required because this is outrageous. What has happened between May 2021 and May 2024? We would not put up with this in any other context.
Do you have a question?
I just have a quick comment. So, since 1876, every Indigenous person in Canada is registered under the Indian Act. So in 1890, when this school first opened up, all of the First Nation bands in British Columbia would be registered under the Indian Act. And those children would be documented that would have been going to that school. Their parents would have been documented as well, because it was illegal for the parents, if the parents didn't send their children to the school, they would go to jail. So all of their families would be documented as well. So there is documentation, physical documentation of children who were registered in Canada as a First Nations person, because all the First Nations people had to go to a residential school in 1890. Every single...
Well, first of all, schools became compulsory in 1920. Before that, it was not. And you only had to go to a residential school if there was not a local school, like a school in the community. So there's a bunch of variations on that situation. But you're entirely correct. That's a great, base of evidence to start working from. That's all I'm saying is that what seems to have happened in the Kamloops case is you had these 215 hits on the GPR, and it was this extrapolation that must have been remains of 215 children. That seems to be been what happened. And that was a completely erroneous assumption, because those 215, as we found with the 15, those were not children. Those were shovel test pits done by the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University. So those other 200 could have been similar kinds of excavations that were done.
Yeah, all I was going to say is that in 1890, these children that were sent to the school, it is possible that 215 of them never returned from that school. If they were listed as a student going to that school, nobody's ever looked at the evidence of how many children graduated from that school and came out of that school.
Well, you would have a bunch of different scenarios in terms of children going to school. Some would have just returned home before they graduated. But why are we assuming that there's these 215 children? That, we have to have some reason.
Because they're finding the anomalies right across the country.
But the anomalies can be other things besides remains. But why are we assuming that the anomalies are remains? Shovel test pits, septic tiles, trees that were ripped out of the apple orchard. There are massive excavations that were done on the Kamloops site. You can't just say anomalies equals remains. And I'm going to mention the Pine Creek case where they decided to excavate in the church basement. So they found these anomalies, they went into the church basement. The knowing of the Knowledge Keepers was that there were children buried in the basement. They excavated that site and they found rocks. There were no remains in the church basement. So there again, anomalies equals remains is not a valid jump of logic. And why are we doing that? Why are we going from anomalies to remains? That is not a logical conclusion to be making.
Oh yeah, so, okay, let's just say that they're not children. But for the ones who we 100% know are the actual bodies of children, if it wasn't murder and it wasn't manslaughter that killed them, if they weren't killed either intentionally or even accidentally by neglect or something like that, then what was it that killed them if it wasn't the residential schools themselves? Was it just random?
Tuberculosis was the major reason why children died in the early years.
Is that not because of the neglect and the poor state of the schools?
No, children died of tuberculosis all over Canada. Children died in reserves from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was a major killer of people. The Spanish flu is another reason why people died. People died of disease at much higher rates because we did not have vaccines, we did not have antibiotics, we did not have all the medicines that we currently have now. Now, in terms of Indigenous circumstances, there definitely was neglect and not appropriate kinds of resources given to various scenarios. But, and it could possibly argue that we're looking at negligence, criminal negligence, manslaughter, all those kinds of categories, but that's not the arguments that are being made. The arguments that are being made is a bunch of priests murdered a bunch of Indigenous children. That's generally what you hear. And that, there is no evidence for that. And priests might have murdered children, but that's a serious charge that needs to have evidence to support it. And you just don't say, oh, there's a death, there's 50 deaths, there's 100, whatever, and therefore there's murdered children. That's not, it has to be an evidentiary basis for making these claims.
Yes.
We'll use the argument that the bodies weren't found, there's no bodies at the Kamloops site. Where did those students go when it shut down? What happened to the people in these schools when it was shut down, when they left the school?
They went back to their communities.
Little on their opinion on this. We have very little coming forward.
First of all, there's 3 Indigenous teachers working at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So it wasn't, there was people, Indigenous people were there. There was a reunion that was held about the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and I believe it was 1978. You know, the Kamloops Indian Residential School, people went back to their communities, they went to other areas in British Columbia. There's no documentation of anyone missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So it is on the onus of the people who are making these claims. So that's all we need to have. But you need to start from the ground up, which are all the historical documents. If those documents seem to be suspicious in some way, then you sort of look at those suspicions and so on. You start there, though. You don't start from the 215 hits on the GPR machine and go, aha, 215 children were murdered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. That's what a number of my colleagues did at Mount Royal University. That was a huge error on their part.
Why don't we have more on these students who finished the school, who didn't pass at the school, who survived the school? Why don't we have as much about them or their families from this end? Like, I don't know if I'm wording myself properly.
Sorry, you were saying why do we not?
Very little evidence I'll use about the case. But we would have more if the argument is that they didn't die. The argument is these students didn't die from the school or anything. Why don't we have as much for your case that if people didn't die?
But I don't have a case. I'm saying the people who are arguing that there's 215 children buried in the Kamloops apple orchard don't have any case. There's no case. That's what we're looking for. Not, I've got to go out and interview every single person who's still alive who went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The onus is not on me. I'm saying these claims were made in May 2021. Where's the evidence for that? And there is no evidence.
It is worth mentioning that, like, in 2022, I think you also mentioned in March of 2022, the Kamloops leaders did retract their statement. Now I don't think they are giving an exact number of the anomalies, and they are still terming as anomalies, not groups, I believe. So are you, when you keep mentioning the people who are making all these claims, are you specifically referring to the leaders of the Kamloops community who are now retracting those claims, or are you talking about the people who are still, I'm assuming, saying the same things that the Kamloops people said before they retracted their statements about the 250 people?
So in 2024, the Kamloops band said 215 anomalies, which is not even true. It was 200 anomalies. It's the leadership of the community, and those are the people who are putting forward these claims. But there was a bunch of different elements in May 2021. These lawyers, 17 of them, all sorts of people making these claims. So it's not the ordinary Indigenous people. I don't even know what the ordinary Indigenous people think about this.
Do you believe that residential schools are a positive institution? Do you believe that the good they did outweighs the bad, or what is your opinion on it?
I think there was bad and good about them.
What was the good?
The good was they taught Indigenous children to read and write and to have various skills. There was terrible abuse that occurred in the residential schools. There was inadequate resources. There was a problem of turning over the schools to the religious authorities who indoctrinated people. There was huge insensitivity that occurred, especially in the early years. So there's all sorts of problems that existed, but there was educational benefits that were provided by the schools.
Could they not have just been taught by their parents at home?
No. In the early years, and many Indigenous parents lobbied for residential schools, which is something that's not mentioned often about these situations.
Okay, my coordinator Ron has a question.
So I want to ask a bigger question, Francis, and that is, we have this kind of scholarly debate, which I think is very important, but I want to get your take on why it's important, because as someone who believes that scholarship should be applied, if it's not applied, there's no real purpose. I see all of these, the kind of debate that's going on or disallowing some of it, that it's really something that's only of relevance to the academy. It's not really something that impacts Indigenous communities. So an example of this would be that while we've been having this debate over the past 5 years, the life expectancy of First Nations in the First Nation that I have most intimately involved with has decreased by about 7 years for men and women. So we're talking about men dying when they're 60, women dying when they're 66 on average. What do these debates within universities, what's the importance of them for dealing with actual issues of today?
Well, I think all of this discussion about the unmarked graves is a kind of a bit of a diversion from the real problems that need to be addressed. So I think that's the first thing. I think that there's a lot of animosity that has been created by this announcement in 2021, which a lot of it is misguided. Like I think that the residential schools have, had serious impacts on communities, but I think right now we need to be dealing with the social problems. So how is spending $330 million on searching for these missing children, which Kimberly Murray, who's now holding some shindig in Gatineau at the Hilton, after spending millions of dollars to do this, is saying there's no missing children. The children are in cemeteries. That's Kimberly Murray said that. All this attention on this, instead of dealing with why is that the case, that you have this lowering of life expectancy, I assume due to the opioid crisis and things like that in the communities. Trying to address those situations. So it's diverting resources into this instead of focusing on the actual problems which exist in Indigenous communities.
You acknowledge that residential schools did participate in abusing students and that they participated in indoctrination. Do you believe that the education that these children were provided justified that abuse? And do you believe that's the original intention of the parents that wanted the residential schools? And do you believe that residential schools should still be defended?
I don't agree. No, I don't think it justifies the abuse. I think that the residential schools have to be put into the context of what was going on between 1870 and 1996. And the residential schools, first of all, in the 1940s, they wanted to shut down the residential schools, the government. They didn't because there was a huge child welfare problem and they didn't know what to do about the child welfare problem if they got rid of the residential schools. So there's another issue that is part of the residential schools. So the residential schools covered a huge period of Canadian history. There was much difference between the residential schools in the 1880s versus the 1960s, and on and on and on. It's a matter of intense evidentiary discussion and analysis. But right now, with people like Sean Carlton, Neegon Sinclair, and Keisha Supernant, we can't have any rational discussion about this issue because there is the accusation that you are basically a Holocaust denier if you try to talk about this. And I think that is outrageous, anti-intellectual, unacademic, and is resulting in complete misunderstanding of all the circumstances that happened historically.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
I was going to say, I don't know if I misunderstood you. Did you say that something you mentioned? Oh no, I heard that.
No, I'm sorry. I appreciate that you want to follow, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to let.
Sorry, it appears from your argument that, like, you say Old Testament is weak and inherently contains misremembrance, and that physical, quote-unquote, non-biased documents are more valuable than the quote-unquote truth.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
It appears from the argument that oral testimony is quote-unquote weak and inherently contains disremembrance, and that physical, quote-unquote, non-biased documents are more violent to truth, quote-unquote. But if you have numerous residential school testimonies,
just in the Survivor Series in TRC, which talks about Kamloops, about the atrocities committed at the schools, does that not prove that these appeals to some sort of universal truth experience at the Indigenous residential schools?
If they all are being said in the presence of one another, there can be, what happens often in testimonies, especially in emotional contexts, if you hear other people's testimonies, you can absorb some of those testimonies as your own. So that's a difficulty with those testimonies. So I think that they are, in each case, one has to look at them and examine them for internal consistency and consistency with others. If they're happening together, if people have heard the testimonies of others, that's something that has to be considered in the context of misremembering.
Does that mean like what I'm saying is, you know, an actual experience then, or is that underplaying kind of what they said is the truth? Like, I feel like
it's something that it has to be weighted with other pieces of evidence. It's a very difficult thing, though. And that's something that people have to consider with what went on at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You had highly suggestible circumstances occurring. I'm not sure if people, and this is the piece that I did on Billy Remembers. There's a case called the Satanic Panic that happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, where all sorts of people remembered things about satanic abuse that occurred because they were hearing other people recount these testimonies. This happens.
is it mass hysteria? Is that what you're saying?
There's elements of that in the residential school testimonies.
Okay, I'm so sorry, I appreciate your questions, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank Dr. Widdowson for coming to talk to us today, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you, I really would. I think you exhibited here today what the Academy should be about, civil disagreement, open dialogue, and debate. I want to thank everyone for being respectful and civil and having productive conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks very much to everyone on the live stream. We'll have a breakdown of this in a few days. I hope you have a good evening.